The Microsoft implementation for individual accounts, the flavor where you store usernames and passwords in your own database, is called ASP.NET Identity. It's available as a scaffolded item, and we'll add it to our project in a second. It's relatively feature complete as it relates to authentication, and it has the following features. It supports all key activity surrounding authentication. This includes registration, along with email confirmation and the ability to resend those confirmation messages, login, an app-based multi-factor authentication, a self-service forgot password flow, account management features which include the ability to change your password, and external login provider support that includes Facebook, Google, Microsoft accounts, and more. It sits on top of a well-designed database schema and has excellent password hashing and other security practices, like avoiding open redirects upon login, and more. On top of all of that, it's highly customizable, even the database schema. So now let's get it added to our project and see it in action. I'm in Rider again, and we're going to use the scaffolding feature to add identity to our existing project. You can for sure use the .NET ASP.NET Code Generator tool to do this from the command line, but there are a few more steps, and it's definitely a little easier to do it from Visual Studio or Rider. We'll start by right-clicking on the project, choosing Add, then New Scaffolded Item. Then I'll choose Identity, and we've got a few choices to make here. The first is whether we should use the default layout in the identity pages. I want to do that, so I'll leave that intact. I don't have any files to override since I haven't done this before, but I can choose the pages we want created as long as they don't already exist. There are a lot of different pages here, and even more if you expand the Manage folder. There are pages to change a password, delete or download personal data, and then if we collapse the Manage folder, you can see pages for login, forgot password, and more. I've got them all checked, so we should get UI pages for each one of these items. The next choice is a data context class, and to keep things separate and distinct, I'm going to create a new data context rather than use the product context we've been using so far in the course. It's suggesting a name that ends with carvedrock.admin context, and I'll just remove the carved rock qualifier there since it shows up earlier in the namespace. This will create an EF Core data context for just the user database. I'll choose the SQLite option here since that's what we're using. And finally, I'll create a new class to represent the user, and this also adds carved rock to the name, which I'll remove to just leave it as admin user. This all looks good now. We'll use our default layout, we'll generate all of the different UI pages, and we'll have new data context and user classes. I'll click Add. This will take just a second, and will build the project as well, and when it finishes, it tells you that it's modified program.cs, and there's a new txt file that gets opened, which has a link to information about ASP.NET Core Identity. I've also included the link in the README, so feel free to delete this file. Let's look at the new code. I'll close the txt file and get rid of the scaffolding output. I'll first open the program.cs file which it said had been modified. There's a missing using statement first off, which I'll add. The new lines that have been added here are at the top. It reads a connection string from configuration, adds the admin context and uses SQLite for it, then adds default identity of type admin user with an option that requires a confirmed account, and adds Entity Framework Stores on the admin context. The one change that happened further down in the file is this app.useAuthentication line, which will add some middleware that supports authentication in general for the app. This new code at the top here was referring to the admin context and admin user classes, and they, along with all of the new UI, was put into what's called an area within our site. There's a new folder called Areas and a subfolder for Identity, and two subfolders in there, Data and Pages. The Data folder is where we'll see the data context and user classes, and we'll come back there in a sec. The Pages are where all of the new UI pages got placed. If you look in the Account folder, you can see a page for Login. And this is what's called a Razor page, which is different than the views we've seen earlier in the course. The markup here should look pretty familiar. It's a CSHTML file, There's a model at the top, and then the content contains a form that will be submitted via a post method, and the form elements use the ASP helper tags we've already seen. A key difference in Razor Pages is that controller classes don't come into play here. The code, and often the model, are defined in CS files that sit behind the CS_HTML files. This file for login defines the login model class right here, which has an input model for an email address and password that use the same type of data annotations that we've seen before. Then there's a method for onGetAsync, which will display the login page, and finally a method for onPostAsync, which is what happens when the user has provided a username and password and hits the login button. The injected sign-in manager has a password sign-in async method that'll return success if the user provided the correct password and logs the user in and gets them redirected. We don't have time to review all of these views in code, but keep in mind that this is scaffolded code, and that you can and probably should make this whatever you want. Just make sure you understand the code and security implications of any changes that you make. Now let's look at the context and user classes, make a couple of minor adjustments, and get it working. Program.cs is using the admin context and admin user classes to wire up authentication for us, and these classes are in the data folder of the new identity area. The admin user is a class that inherits from identity user, and there's a comment here that says we can add more profile data to the user by adding properties. This is basically a POCO that's used by the data context. If we add a property here, then add an EF migration, that will add the new property to the database table for users. The data context that was created is here, and it inherits from identity DB context for type admin user, which defines the various DB sets for the tables in this schema. I'm going to paste in some new code here for the class content, which will configure a SQLite database like we did for our product context. It'll put the database in the local app data folder and use a file name defined within configuration, the user DB file name to be precise. Let's update the app settings JSON to have this new value. The scaffolding process added this new admin context connection, and I'll replace it with our user DB file name, which I'll set to crauth.db. Then, back in program.cs, we don't need to read the connection string here anymore since we're doing that in the data context class. And adding the admin context doesn't need the use SQLite for the same reason. We're almost there, just a couple of more edits. If you look down in the Views shared folder, there's a new file called login_partial. This was also added when we scaffolded identity. If you take a peek here, there's a couple of injected items at the top, a sign-in manager and a user manager, and then there's a conditional block that checks to see if the user is signed in, and that includes a link to manage your account and a link to log out. The else block, if you're not logged in, has a link to register and a link to log in. This is a partial that we should add to the nav bar in the main layout of our app, so let's do it. But first, here's a very quick aside on partial views, which are something you can use to break up larger sets of markup into smaller and more manageable ones, or to avoid repeating the same content and markup on multiple views. You define a partial view and include the logic and markup that you want. A typical convention is to prefix the file name with an underscore, and often to use the word partial at the end. To use that partial view in a page view, you use the partial tag helper on the main view where you want the partial to be rendered. Now let's add the login partial to our main layout. Here's the layout file, and at the bottom of the nav bar is the closing tag for a UL element. I'll add the login partial there using the partial tag helper. All of the new UI pages are Razor pages, as I said before, and back in program.cs, we need to add middleware that'll enable the handling of those Razor pages. On top of the map controller route line, I'll add app.mapRazorPages, and that should do the trick. Finally, the user database is going to use EF Core, and as such, it requires migrations to update and apply schema. To stay consistent with the approach for our dev data and migrations, I'll add a couple of lines here that will get an admin context and apply migrations for that, with a reminder that this works really well for local development, But if you're going to higher environments like production or testing environments, you should probably have different processes to apply schema change. We haven't actually created a migration for the admin context yet, so let's do that now. We can use the .NET EF Migrations add command, and I've provided a name of initial identity. But there's more than one context in our project now, so we need to provide a -c arg to indicate which data context we want to use. The carvedrock.admin.data admin context. And then to separate the files here, I'll use the -o flag to specify the output directory where I want the migration put, a subfolder of migrations called auth. That completes, so let's look at the new migration. Here it is, and it's got a table called ASP.NET Roles and another one called ASP.NET Users. This table has a username, a password hash, and other interesting properties like security stamp and two-factor enabled. Let's run the app and see if this works. Here's the app, and two new links are at the top right of the navbar: register and log in. This is perfect since I haven't already logged in. There are no users either, so let's try registering. That brings up a register page where we can provide an email address and a password that we need to confirm. I'll provide eric@email.com, which doesn't really exist, and then a simple password. I get a validation error that says it's got to be at least 6 characters long. So now I'll provide a better password, confirm it, and click register. This takes me to a registration confirmation page, which is telling me that we don't have an email sender registered and a pointer to some docs. It also includes a link to manually confirm the account since we don't have an email sender, and I'll click that. That shows a page where we confirmed our email. Great. Let's try logging in now. eric@email.com, the password I used, and we get logged in. You can see the username at the top right along with a logout link. If you click the username, we see the Manage Your Account page, and I'll let you explore this in more detail on your own, with the reminder that once again, all of this is scaffolded code. These features are all very common and useful for security around authentication, but nothing at all stops you from changing how they look or behave. Finally, I'll click the products link, which works fine, and I guess isn't that surprising. But now I'll log out, and the register and login links show up again, which is great. I'll click the products link one more time, and we see the page again. Let's make a change so that our products and categories features are only available to logged in users next.